Terraform Cloud, what is it and how do you set one up? And also some of the best practices from a security perspective for Terraform Cloud. If you are thinking about setting an interview for a DevOps role, cloud role, or cloud engineer role, or maybe even a cloud security role, this is going to be the video for you to help you get through that. Especially if you are a beginner, I'll go through how do you set up Terraform Cloud, what are some of the security best practices so you get those extra brownie points when you explain Terraform Cloud to the interviewer. Let's start off with just the explanation of what Terraform Cloud is. And as you go through it, feel free to skip through and go straight to the setup part if that's what you're more interested in. But if you have never done Terraform Cloud before and you don't know what that is, follow along. So Terraform Cloud, is it a virtual machine or a cloud resource? Turns out the answer is infrastructure as code is what Terraform Cloud is. And if you might wonder, what's the infrastructure as code? A simple, super 30-second viewpoint is infrastructure is basically any server or virtual machine that you create in a resource, in a data center, in a public cloud context, or any form of resource that you require to build an application. That would be called an infrastructure. And when you do that as a code, specifically in this context, using something called HCL or HashiCorp language, you can use Terraform to build infrastructure as code, which would help you create infrastructure automatically. That's what infrastructure as code is. I like to talk about these things in the case of a business use case. The business use case for this would be if you're sitting in an interview and you've been asked a question around, okay, how would you set up a Terraform Cloud? But also, let me know how would you apply security best practice for it. Now, this is a very common business use case for someone who may be a DevOps engineer or a platform engineer in the context of an organization. So as I mentioned earlier, feel free to skip this straight to the setup part and go straight to the business use case if you don't want to understand the basic foundational piece, which would help you when you are trying to go through a setup. So for people who are following along, follow along to understand the foundational pieces as you understand what's required for you to be able to build a secure Terraform Cloud environment. First one being, how does Terraform work in the first place? Terraform has a write, plan, apply workflow. Write is basically in the Terraform Cloud context, you can have a Terraform project. Within that, you could have a Terraform workspace, which would contain Terraform configuration state file. Now, state file is probably the most important file for your Terraform setup because state file is what tells the Terraform workflow engine that, hey, I need 5 servers with these configuration and this is what needs to be. So that's why Terraform state file is important. In the case of Terraform Cloud, it is stored directly in Terraform Cloud. But if you were to use just Terraform, that would be stored as a main.tf file on your local repository. Now, once you've written what your infrastructure needs to be as a stateful file, you can then start building a plan for it, which is simply Terraform plan, which is a dry run of what have you written as the configuration state file and what would it produce. You just get a confirmation for it. Once you're happy that the plan is going to execute on the infrastructure and the resources that you want to create, you can do a Terraform apply. That's how a workflow for a Terraform works. Now you may be thinking, isn't there another competition to infrastructure as code? Why are we talking about Terraform? Yes, every cloud provider out there has their own infrastructure as a code capability. A common one that I want to point out over here is CloudFormation template. AWS has its own version of infrastructure as code as CloudFormation. Azure, GCP, all of them have one. But in this specific tutorial series that we're going through with Andrew Brown and everyone else, we're going to specifically work on the provider, which is AWS. So that's why I'm using the example of AWS CloudFormation, which is the infrastructure as code language provided by Amazon themselves. Now, this is great if you were to just work in Amazon, but imagine now suddenly you're multi-cloud, you have Azure, AWS, you're trying to build a Kubernetes environment, then Terraform becomes really handy. So if you look at the workflow then, you build your infrastructure, you wrote your state file, you wrote your configuration file, you plan, do a test run, as I mentioned earlier. Then you apply the change, but this time, instead of just saying, oh, apply my change to AWS, I can apply that to Kubernetes, I can apply that to Google Cloud, Azure, and then it just goes and uses APIs of each of these are called providers. Each of these providers, it can build resources over there. So that's where Terraform becomes super important. Because we're talking about security as well, in an interview, they might ask you, what would be a security concern you may have while you build Terraform Cloud? I would talk about some of the shared risks that you hold with Terraform Cloud. Now, Terraform Cloud in this context, and in fact, even the Terraform, which is the version that you have locally on your machine, has the same challenges of unauthorized access, injection possible. Inside a thread, I may just decide to be a bad person. There might be a malware in the repository that's being shared, misconfiguration of access control that may give me privilege information that I should not have access to. Data breach is another common one as well. And it can probably even expand to a lot more. You can think about things like your auto deployment. Terraform Cloud and Terraform in general are designed in a way that if you make a change in a repository in GitHub or wherever your source code is, it automatically deploys it. Now, if I was to get access to the source code and I change what's in the source code, I can deploy a malicious code onto the Terraform Cloud and may potentially extend from that onto a provider that I may manage. Now, state file, as I called out earlier, is super important. Having that just lying around or probably not using it appropriately. In the context of Terraform Cloud, at least the state file is saved within the Terraform Cloud console, so it makes it a bit more easier. As long as you manage the access to Terraform Cloud, limit that to the number of people you want to provide access to, and limit the people who have access to projects, or maybe even limit that to specific workspaces that they should have access to. Another one which is quite common is modules, where you can make your own package which can be used by anyone in the organization for what should Terraform configuration look like for a specific use case as well. So that and a lot more happens to be some of the security challenges you would get across. Now, enough about the challenges. Let's go through the walkthrough and talk about how would you set this up the right way. Now we're ready to set up our Terraform Cloud. You need three things for this. You need access to Terraform Cloud, which is app.terraform.io/session. You need access to an AWS account. You also need access to GitHub or any other repository that you may have where you can store some code. We'll start with the obvious, which is Terraform Cloud to start off with. Now, I don't have a login account. I'm going to create one with you, so at least you get to see what I'm doing as well. Now, it's worthwhile calling out from a best practice perspective. If you already have an account with HashiCorp, you can simply continue with HCP account and provide that, or maybe even link your GitHub account in there as well and use that as a way to engage everything on HashiCorp. Now, this is one way to do it. If you were a user of all the HashiCorp products, then maybe that could be something you could consider. But because this is a tutorial and we obviously are talking about an interview, if this was an enterprise interview, I would say you would recommend signing in with SSO or single sign-on would be the way you would say it. You would not recommend a free account. If you were a startup, then maybe it makes sense to go for a free account. But most likely, if you are interviewing or talking to a person inside an enterprise, you should recommend signing in with SSO. Okay, so now we obviously got another option to do HTTP account, but so I filled out my details, my email, my password. I'm just going to also call out what my terms of use are and privacy policy. All right, let's try and create an account now. Okay, this is the screen you would see once you've confirmed your email and now you're logged into Terraform Cloud. You probably see these three options. As you can see, for this particular course, the easiest option would be to go for a provisioning example resources. But this is an interview example, so I'm just going to go into create new organization. This is a bit more complex, but if you bear with me, you should at least be able to work through this. So let's just say I say my organization name is Cloud Security Bootcamp. Okay, so where you create the organization, I'm going to put my name and email and hit create organization to be able to just create an organization for the enterprise organization that I work with. Cool. This is the first screen we'll see. Now, this is worthwhile knowing that because this business use case is to create a Terraform Cloud environment, and we have chosen to go down the organization path instead of simply trying to create resources. One example would be just to simply start resources if you were a startup. But if you're looking at enterprise, you're most likely looking at creating something called a workspace. Now, workspace is a logical boundary to define the infrastructure as code you're creating. This is where your source code that you should talk to, or at least your Terraform should talk to, would be. This is also where all the settings for your state file, configuration file that I spoke about in the presentation, this is where that would be stored. And you can choose how the flow would work. Now, workspace is just one concept. There's another layer on top of it. If you notice over here, it says projects and workspaces. A project can be a collection of workspaces. So in this particular scenario, I'm just going to use, which is the most common one as well, the version control flow. But workflow just basically means how do you want the different steps to be. If you remember the diagram that I showed you in my presentation, it was write the code, do a plan, and then do an apply. It's the same way over here. We should be able to just use the version control flow. Now, there are different providers you can use. These are all repositories. My particular one is GitHub. I am just going to use github.com, and it recognizes the fact that, oh, look at that, I'm already logged in. So do you want to authorize Terraform Cloud? Yep, I want to authorize Terraform Cloud. This should collect and pull. Oh, let me just do this. Allow, and let's try this again. It's good for me to show you the steps that happen as well. All right, now that's happened. Another one comes in. All right, now obviously I've got multiple organizations. in my GitHub repository, but you should be able to just use the one that is for your organization. And once you do that, this is a place where I would say security practice comes in. You probably want to be careful and not give access to all the repositories. You only want to give it to selected ones. You select the one. I recently created one called Terraform Collection. Maybe I type it in. It should just come up. Oh, there you go. That's the one. So this is very important. You don't want to give access to all your repositories. You just want to give access to just the repositories that you want to work with. This is also known as least privilege or security by design for people who are into the learning about security. So I'm going to install. All right, I have the code. Cool. All right, so it understands the repository. I've got the repository here, and I'm just going to use the default project. I don't have any. Now, you can change the project. You can also change the particular workspace inside that you want to work with. You can see every workspace must belong to a single project. Projects must be named uniquely within an organization. Now, I'm just going to go for the default project, but in your organization case, you might have something specific. So this is also some of the finer details. You can go for an auto apply. Auto apply basically means that whenever there's a change in the repository, it is simply going to just start running the plan and start running apply. And that's how you would trigger it. You can trigger an automatic run. If you do it manually, you have to have a comment or something left as an approval step by someone who's basically approving the workflow. That's how you do it. You can. I'm not going to include any of the other complexity, but from an interview perspective, choosing the kind of integration, whether it's GitHub, GitLab, or any other repository that you want to talk to, also choosing the code on the path of organization, that would be a great helpful for you to pass your interview, at least the interview question from a basic perspective. All right, I'm going to create my workspace. It's going to parse through this, and it's also going to try and build up a collection before I start my first plan. So, all right, so now I am ready in a state where I can have a look at creating a new plan for myself or adding variables. But instead, I'm just going to go to the workspace so I can see what that is. All right, as you can see, I can probably give this a description over here. I can say, this is my workspace for all Terraform bootcamp tutorials. Now, you may also want to go choose new project, and you might say, okay, this is my development environment. You can say this is my test environment, because the other one was my development environment, the test environment. Now I have two projects, and I can go, oh, by the way, I think I want to change the project of this to test environment. Look at that. But what that also means is if I create any more workspaces, if I just create another one, just for an example, I'm going to use the same one. Yep, Terraform Collection, project. I'm just going to go test environment again. As you can see where it's going, I can create multiple workspaces in one project. So the way to define this would be, if I was doing some kind of a creation of a setup for a business, I would go, okay, am I building it for an application? All right, so my Terraform project would be the name of the application. I would have a application for either just that predict. If it's going to be one environment, I just have one project, one environment. But if I have multiple environments, then I probably want to structure it in a way that you can scale it. Some people may choose the path of having a project per environment, because anything you have in an environment, you can basically have it shared in terms of workspaces. Okay, so another thing now we want to look at is if you click this arrow over here, you'll see different projects, and you can edit the settings of a project. I can just rename to prod if I want to, or just delete the project if I need to. Now, you would also see a few more options on the left. So I'm going to close this, and if you look at the options on the left, modules is an interesting one, which is again is an intermediate one, but essentially the idea is you should be able to use your specific private modules from private repositories to share, this is how we think the right policy, or this is how we think is the right way to create a EC2 instance in an AWS account, and you can build that as a module, so I can just search for the module and put that in. Now there are publicly available repositories as well. You can just go over here. Now you can also type in AWS, and that should show you all the existing ones out there. Now, the one that I'll call out over here is that the ones from Terraform itself, they're probably good to use. I would not, but I would, the ones that are from Terraform, But one thing I'll call out over here, if you look at any one of these, if you look at that, the first one, the published by Terraform AWS, provider is AWS. Provider is what service would it be talking to, and published by is, hey, who is publishing it? And turns out it's actually turns out it's actually the Terraform themselves are promoting it. So this is a good one to go for. But this is a URL, registry.terraform.io. You can find as many registries and providers and modules which are publicly available for you to use. You can go to AWS, Oracle Cloud. As you can see, there's so many providers that you can work through. Go down the path of Azure as well. But for the context of this, I'm going to come back over here. And if you go back to registry, you have the power to use something from public repository. But if we were talking about intermediate or advanced, we'll build our own module and we can do a walkthrough. By the way, if you want me to show you how to build a module, definitely drop that as a comment and I would help you build a small module and just attach it to a repository as well. So that's where the first setup is. So far we spoke about how to set up a project, how to set up a workspace, how to set up probably modules as well if you were that intermediate. Now let's go into settings and what this will allow us to do. All right, now looking at the settings over here, I'm gonna try and find teams. This is probably the next important thing you want to think about. You can add new team members, which is a great idea if you are just looking for multiple teams. But the reason I think this is important is you can look at only visible team members and organization owners. So team owners is basically super admin or basically an admin permission, which is what I'm part of because I create the account. But what you might want to do is you may also want to have other kinds of users as well. So let's just say if I go in here and I add a user and add the name, but I can make them owner straight away. But sometimes you might want them to be regular users as well. Now you obviously have users here, as I mentioned. Teams, because this is a free version, you would only see the ability to have an owner permission. If this was a paid version of Terraform Cloud and you are a large enterprise, you would also see a version to manage team members as well. So you can give them non-owner permission. So limit the number of people who would have access to the Terraform Cloud in the first place. So that's most of what I wanted to talk about from a setup perspective. Next one, if I go into my workspace itself in the collection, I tried running it, but obviously I don't have anything in there to run. But this is how you would start setting it up. In the next example of this, and by the way, feel free to suggest what more would you like me to cover from a Terraform Cloud setup perspective, but this is the first Terraform tutorial. If you have more questions about Terraform Cloud security and how do you do security in Terraform Cloud, by the way, if you enjoy content like this, definitely hit the like button so I get to know that, hey, this is the kind of content you like, you want more tutorials. And before I go on to talking about security best practices for Terraform Cloud, I just want to say that if there is specifically anything that you want me to cover, by the way, if you want me to cover anything in specific, there is cloudsecuritybootcamp.com. You can just go to the button. The current cohort is closed, but you can subscribe and put the information you need, and we'll be more than happy to cover that for you in the next module that we do. But for now, let's go back to the presentation and go through some of the security best practices for Terraform Cloud so you can do a great job at the interview. All right. Let's go to that. Now we spoke about the right way to do Terraform Cloud setup, including some of the security conversations. But let's talk about security best practice because, you want those brownie points when people ask you for the interview. So the security best practice for Terraform Cloud would include things like, as I mentioned earlier, making sure the access to Terraform Cloud itself is managed. You have the right kind of people having access to the organization, which is admin user privileges. You probably want to limit the number of people who have access to that. You also want to limit the number of people who have access to specific projects. Now, projects are a collection of workspaces, so you're giving access to people with more than one. You can also look at the most recent version of Terraform if it is a practical thing for you to use, especially if there is anything specific that makes you do security better. VCS repository, or also known as the repository where the code is stored, you should only work with the repositories that you trust and not have an untrusted repository anywhere close to what you're using. Which also goes for the modules as well. Like the modules that you end up using, make sure that you integrate only with the modules that you have created yourself and you trust. Which brings me to the API tokens that are used by the Terraform Cloud to talk to your provider, as well as the provider access keys that would be used to talk about this as well. Limit the access to these repositories, and access control would probably limit, I would probably say 60 to 70% of the problems that you might have to face. Last but not least is talking about Terraform security compliance, which is probably one of the reasons you might want to limit. You might want to check the infrastructure being created by your Terraform, that it matches the compliance requirements for your organization as well. With that said, you should be able to use this information to at least have the right best practices to start building infrastructure on providers using Terraform Cloud. I'll see you in the next video. We'll talk about week 2 of Terraform Cloud. But if you enjoy content like this and tutorials on cloud security, Terraform, Kubernetes, definitely give a subscribe and follow. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.